Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thanks for stopping by again. Today I've got three things I want to talk about. As I do every once in a while, I try to hit some topics that might not deserve an entire video. So that's happening today, two of them in response to questions. The first one I'll talk about today it's something I'm going to be raising every month or two until January of next year, because I know people come in and see a specific video. I may mention it once, but they'll never see it if they don't see that video. So I'll be putting it in more than one video to let people know in advance, to be prepared for this. I've discovered that, unlike me, a lot of people plan their trips well in advance, sometimes many months in advance, sometimes a year in advance or more. And when that's the case, if you don't know something big is happening that period of time when you're planning to come down, when you get there, all of a sudden find it's gotten a lot more complicated than you expected. Now, that's happening here in January of 2019. The event is called World Youth Day. Now, it actually covers about a week of activity. It runs from January 22nd to January 27th here in Panama City. It's sponsored by the Roman Catholic Church. It is outreach to young people, young adults, all over the world. And they come together, they have workshops, they have seminars, they have all sorts of gatherings here. And it culminates on the final day, that's actually World Youth Day, where an open-air mass is celebrated by the Pope. This is obviously a very big event, and it has been held in the past in cities like Rome and Paris, Madrid, Buenos Aires, big one there, Sydney, Australia, Manila had 5 million people show up for the final mass. Lord knows where they did it and how they handled it, but it must have been interesting. In any case, they anticipate approximately 200,000 young people attending this. Now, originally they'd said 175,000. They've raised it because they've already had over 100,000 register. And registration isn't just a matter of saying you want to come. You have to pay a variety of fees. And so there's commitment to it. So there are over 100,000 already definitely planning to come, and it's anticipated that will reach 200,000 by the time we get to January of next year, as many of them are raising their money to do this. So we have 200,000 of them, and an additional 200,000 people are expected to take part in some of the activities, and these will be probably people from Panama and the surrounding area who are, many of them may not be young people, but they want to be involved as well. And then with the Pope's celebration of the Mass, an additional 100,000 people are expected to show up for that. So on that particular day, the 27th of January of 2019, we expect about 500,000 guests in our city. And for the days prior to that, 200 to 400,000 people constantly in motion. So as you might guess, hotel rooms are going to be pretty much booked up. Traffic should be fun, although thankfully, at least they tell us the second metro line will be functioning sufficiently to be of some help to this whole affair. It's going to be quite an event, and people have opened their homes here for young people to stay and so on, but the hotels will be packed. Well, we expect 7,000 media representatives alone, and a whole convention center has been set aside for them, and newspapers, publications of various sorts, television, radio, what have you, from all over the world. So it is held every 3 or 4 years. I tell you that if it had been 10 years ago, almost certainly for this part of the world, the selection would have been Bogota in Colombia, which is a much larger city and a much more populous nation. But instead, it was Panama City. And there won't be another one in this general area, probably for a couple of decades, because as they move around. And they've done Buenos Aires, for example, they've done Denver and Colorado was the one they held in the U.S. and so forth. Here they are in the middle of the Americas in Panama City, and it's just an incredible honor to have received it. For those of us who are not Catholic in background, it's not a problem. I mean, we're pleased. Everyone's pleased, basically, because we see a very friendly group of people. They have a very good reputation for being very, very wonderful people who come. They're young people, they're dedicated, they're enthusiastic, they're polite, and they're not troublemakers or anything of that sort. And it means $250 million is expected to be pumped into the Panamanian economy as a result of this gathering. I mean, we're talking something very big. So any convention of people, regardless of what their background might be, is going to be welcome here in Panama. But this is something way larger than any convention. And the whole country is going to do, everyone will do what they can on behalf of Panama, because we know we're on display to the world, and we want this to work well. And I want it to work well for you too. So basically what it boils down to is that the week is 22nd to the 27th of January, but you can assume basically from January 20th through, say, January 30th, to give people time to arrive, people time to depart, and so on, that during that period it's going to be more challenging than ever before to find a hotel room. So it doesn't mean you won't be able to, but my attitude is really very simple. If you must come around that area and that week is going to be part of your trip, that's probably a very good time to go out in the countryside and look at the rest of Panama, as the city will be extremely busy at that stage. I sort of look forward to it. It should be interesting to see all these young people. But I plan to do it by sitting in my balcony, not be out in the middle of it too much more than I have to. So it's something to keep in mind. It will have an impact, and it needn't be a problem for you if you're aware of it in advance and take it into consideration when you make your own plans. So I want to mention that, and as I say, I'll mention it a few more times in months to come. So those of you preparing to come down will have that on your list of things to keep in mind. Now, a couple questions have come in. One of those, I mentioned that in terms of gasoline prices, that our prices were cheaper than they were in Costa Rica, and people said, well, how much are gasoline prices in the area? Now, the Central American countries produced a monthly report on their cost per gallon. They still use the gallon in U.S. dollars for their gasoline. And because we're so nearby, they include Panama as a list. Panama's statistics are provided by the government here. So let's take a look at them. All right. I've got Panama in yellow down there at the bottom. I think it's very obvious who is the cheapest in this particular area. And as I'd mentioned, Costa Rica is more expensive, and you can see that that is the case. Now, prices go up and down with the world market, of course, like they do everywhere else. But the difference between nations is very static during this period. I think maybe once or twice in the last decade have I seen somebody get as low as Panama on one grade of gasoline. Oh, by the way, regular means typically 91 octane, and special is 95 octane. All right, so those are the per gallon prices in dollars. If you think in terms of liters, a liter is less than 1/4 of a gallon. So about 25% of that price, then maybe 10% taken off that, and you've got roughly the price per liter. But it's not so much the price per liter or the price per gallon. You have a tank, you're going to fill it up, and the price is going to be cheaper in Panama than it is in any of these other countries. The difference is fairly substantial, and although it may seem like a relatively minor thing, if you live here, odds are you're going to have to drive. You're going to be using, if you have your own vehicle, this is going to be an expense. It's going to be an expense just as it is at home today. For some in Europe, it's going to seem cheap. For some in the U.S., it may seem not so cheap. But the simple fact of the matter is you can save a fairly substantial amount of money if you do a lot of driving over the course of a year if you're in Panama. So something to keep in, certainly not a reason to come live here, but it's something nice to know. Now, another question that I'm frequently asked is, what about sales taxes and things of this sort? So a little over a year ago, I sat down and did the research necessary to put together a list of taxes in Latin America that I could get, and I got most of them. They're not that difficult, but you do have to dig around. There are two kinds of taxes used here, and one is the sales tax, which is very well known in the U.S., for example. And then the other is the value-added tax, which is very common in Europe and other parts of South America and so on. It doesn't make any difference. Basically, the tax is a tax. It's going to be figured into the cost of the item you buy. So you're going to be paying it, even if it doesn't show up entirely on your bill. In a value-added tax, some of it will have already been paid by others before you, but they're getting it back from you when you buy. So keeping that in mind, the difference in the tax rates here are the difference in how much you're going to be spending extra in terms of taxes, regardless of whether it shows up on the receipt as it does with the sales tax, very obviously, or not. So let's take a look at those. Here we go. All right. As you can see, our 7% doesn't look so bad. Now, some people in the States say, oh, yeah, but our sales tax is lower. Well, maybe so. But ours isn't bad at all, and it's less than some states pay, and certainly some cities in some states. You should visit New York sometime. But anyhow, as you can see in Latin America, the taxes on purchase of goods and services is pretty substantial. In fact, much more so than they are in the U.S. and in Canada. I can't claim for Europe, but I would think they're probably pretty high for Europe as well. I don't know, but here we're only concerned about comparisons. So we've got Uruguay up there at the top at 22%. Brazil is variable because it charges different taxes on different things, and so it can be anywhere from 17 to 25%. The cheapest other country than Panama is Venezuela, which runs between 8 and 12%. But as I say on here, if you can find anything to buy, that country is in a very poor state, and it's a disaster. And we all feel very sorry for it. So it could have been left off the list for all practical purposes. Not many people are retiring to Venezuela these days. But it's included. It's one of those. And hopefully someday that situation will change. But in any event, as you can rapidly see, this makes a major difference. And again, you're going to be buying things wherever you go. So when we talk about cost of living, of course, obviously, if you're purchasing a home or renting a place, this is a major expense. But there are other expenses that, taken separately, may not be all that huge, but you collect them over the course of a year, and they can amount to a lot of money. And if you're paying 3 times as much, or twice, or 4 times as much, almost, in taxes for goods you buy than you would in Panama, then you're paying a substantial premium to live in another country than Panama. Again, it's not the sort of thing to make the decision for you. There are so many other things that you have to take into account. But we don't give ourselves credit sometimes. This is what happens in a country that has oh, I have a little thunder in the background, if you can hear that. It is rainy season. But we're living in a country that's working, where the economy is growing, it's stable, and so forth. It isn't as necessary for the Panamanian government to charge these higher taxes. For many of these countries, they don't have a lot to sell, or maybe the price they're getting for what they sell is pretty miserable. They depend more and more on this kind of tax, a consumption tax, from purchases made locally just to keep the government operating. And they get pretty steep, and even then they don't often get enough. And right now in Costa Rica there's a controversy going on because it's 13% sales tax. They're discussing changing it into a value-added tax, but they're doing it in such a way that they'll spread the tax into new groups of services and goods, and the sum result will be that you pay more in taxes. Even though technically it's still 13%, you'll end up paying more. Costa Ricans were not born yesterday. They can see through this. So there's been a considerable amount of discussion, but that government's had a lot of trouble meeting its expenses and even getting a budget approved. So I think the critical thing here is that it's not going down. All right. So there you go. There are 3 things here today. One is to remind you about January, and the other is to share this business of taxation that is statistics that are readily available to me, that I can give you a better idea of how to make some comparisons that are not made at other websites and aren't really discussed very much at all. I hope they're a little bit helpful, and the last 2 particularly are answers to questions that have been sent to me recently, and I hope I've answered your questions successfully. So thank you for stopping by, and I look forward to seeing you again.